Welcome to Expert English Academy. Learn English with interesting story. He picked up his guitar and strummed it, idly at first, casually. She watched his thick, heavy hands moving across the board in wide strokes. It was hypnotic, restful, and she began to relax. He changed to a beautiful melody, picking each note with a finger or thumb. Sarah watched his fingers, marveling at how fast they could work, at how delicate and precise the tips of thick fingers of rough hands could be. She felt herself sinking in the rhythm and wondered how her boyfriend didn't get lost himself, how he could think fast enough to move from string to string so seamlessly, so accurately. Looking to Mark's face, she saw his half-open gray-green eyes, as distant as the stars, as close as her pulse. Lost in his own way, she thought. It wasn't concentration keeping him in tune, but a flow, a deep sensual memory that called the right fingertip to the right string at the right time. He was truly in tune with his guitar, one with it inside the strings' music, their vibrations, their changes and movements, rises and falls. Mark was most beautiful when he was like this. He picked up the speed to a desperate rhythm, fingers flickering back and forth, seeming sometimes to bring out two separate sounds that quickly dissolved into a single one, rising and falling again. The tempo increased another step change and furiously reached a peak of high-pitched, longer waving wails. He stopped, so alive, so awake, so turned on. He lifted the guitar gently from his lap and, leaning over, placed it carefully back on its stand. His body seemed changed, as if the music had awakened him and brought him a new life. He sat back on the edge of his seat, pushing his ass back onto it, then moving his hips forward, repositioning himself from his crotch outward, a pulse of energy running down his thighs and calves, up through his hidden stomach, chest and broad shoulders, and down through his very visible muscular arms past the thick leather strap he wore on his wrist, to his skillful hands. Sarah looked up to his face, his life-giving lips, his long hair, straight but wild, brown but with a hint of dirty blonde. His face seemed eager, hungry. He let his eyes, green now, strong, fall on her, into her. In that moment she knew that he was going to fuck the shit out of her and he wasn't going to wait. Unbutton your shirt. She moved her hands to the bottom button. Start at the top, he corrected, and she started to undo herself until she was a button below the bottom of her bra. Stop. She stopped, just a little exposed, the flesh of her small curves visible. Pull the sides so I can see more. She complied. She could see he was starting to enjoy himself. She could see him coming alive to her, focusing his attention on her. More than that, stretch the fabric. More than that, pull the shirt under your tits. She pulled the shirt, her breasts pushed up and together even as they strained outward against the constricting material. She ventured a question, like this? Like that, came the reply. Now pull down your bra. She pulled the bra down. It was tighter and pushed her breasts up into a more obvious, more obscene outspilling of flesh. She felt her chest swell as if it had become the center of her and saw him staring at her framed beauty, focused, awestruck. She saw his own straining. He touched himself through his jeans without realizing it, his mind, his body all directed toward her. Her nipples hardened in response to his gaze. He grabbed her waist, picked her up and turned her so that she knelt on the couch, her legs on the seat, her feet dangling over the edge, her body leaning forward against the cushioned back, her backside sticking out. "Pull up your skirt." She pulled up her skirt, exposing her thighs and private parts and expansive ass covered in red cotton. "Pull your knickers between your ass cheeks." She pulled so the knickers became a tight red strip of cotton, revealing the two large mounds of her rear on either side. Mark grabbed her ass roughly, then licked and slapped as he moved his face down lower between her legs. His eyes followed the pulled red cotton riding through the line of her ass to the stopping point, a thin strip of red stained darker with wetness and want, and then the bulge of her hidden fleshy lips squashed between the cotton. "Open your legs." She parted herself more, feeling her wetness opening farther. She heard him swallow before continuing. "Pull the material between your pussy lips." She did it so that just that thin strip covered her entrance and her engorged lips spilled over either side. "Wiggle it," he instructed, and she whimpered as the material dragged against her clit between the separated fleshes. "Hold it to one side." The wet center of her hole was exposed as she moved the red material, and she felt Mark's hot breath on her. She felt him pull the cotton away from her and heard the rip as he disposed of the barrier with his hands. Then his face was where she wanted it, sucking between her legs, wet on her wetness. He pulled away to look at her and slipped 2 fingers into her hole, watching them disappearing in and out of her as she started to moan. She pulled her hips up a little and instinctively he pushed down on the 2 fingers, nudging against the front wall inside of her, giving and taking away the pressure to a slow beat. His thumb took a little of the wetness from her entrance and then curved around and up to find her fattened clit. He massaged it from side to side before joining the rhythm of the fingers inside her. He squeezed and released, inside and out, as if holding all of her pleasure in the palm of his hand. She moaned louder as he played her skillfully, her heat rising, her sensations flowing through his hand, through her deepest parts. Her body was awakened and alive, she wanted all of him. "Fuck me, Mark," she spoke with a gasp to punctuate her urgency. "Mark, fuck me." He pulled out his hand, leaving the gap inside her, the open hole, wet, ready, wanting him. She felt his body against her, she felt him at her entrance, in her wetness. She felt him slip inside. She felt his hardness touching her sensitized walls, felt his heat on her awakened flesh. She felt the expanse of him filling her and then his movement, his perfect movement. He thrust along and through her, filling her with desire and its satisfaction, wanting and giving. As he thrust inside, he leaned to cover her with his body, his mouth on her neck sucking, biting. His hands were on her breasts, the rough palms cupping and grabbing, rubbing. The delicate dexterous tips of his fingers squeezing and turning her nipples. She felt his breath and his life as he licked near her ear, and she enjoyed all of his weight on her. Each time he sank inside of her, she felt herself holding him there in her center, the hot closeness of him deep inside, the slight easing of the weight on her back as all the muscles of his body pulled hard and tight, his hips pressing forward against her as she strained back against him, each wanting to be deeper, closer. She felt his body weight against her again as he relaxed slightly and they rode the wave toward the next thrust, in and out, as the pressure and movement from his crotch, rising and falling, seemed to expand outward through her, taking control of their whole bodies. Her breasts, still framed by her bra, felt the last of his touch as he pulled his hands away, leaving the hot imprint of his skillful caress over the tingling flesh and her nipples vibrating with the memory of his masterful finger work. He moved his hands down to rest his palms on her sides, his fingers curved around her hips as all attention fell to their shared center, his movements hungrier, faster, the pulse inside her louder, crying out for its release. Her breasts shuddered as he banged hard against her, his breath now in tune with her moans. She drove back hard against him as he thrust into her vigorously. She felt her heat rise to its final peak as he tensed and plowed into her with a final extra force, and she held him there a second longer, feeling her heat pour into him as he poured himself into her. Twice more for joy he slowly rolled into her, filling her. He held her, their bodies together at last as she forgot everything but their feeling deep inside her, their life and pleasure, their stillness and movement, their silence and music.